is about war and memory, as I mentioned, based on our study, which we've been conducting for many years about the Armenian community and the Syrian war. As any anthropological study, the processes are still underway, and the final conclusions are always thirsty for additional material and new interpretation. In this respect, I would like to begin by a small episode from our field work. It was the April 24 commemoration day 10 days ago. During our discussions, which is very characteristic, whenever the issue of Deir ez-Zor pops up, people are mostly unaware that it's a city. Deir ez-Zor is associated with the crime, and the desert is the scene of the crime. Italo Pardo and Giuliano Pardo claim that cities during their development transform, change, evolve, industrial, post-industrial, sacred, hallowed. We're not dealing with the transformation of the city, but rather with the collective, the absence of the city and collective conscience. In this respect, one has to understand and look at the issue as to how the place erases the perception of the city in the Armenian collective identity. I have to single out the Syrian and Lebanese context because they are from these environment and are aware that there is always a city, but in our general perception, there is always associated with the scene of the crime. On another issue is that about 20 years ago, the first pilgrimage took place to, since the Syrian war, that was the first public event that restored the commemoration of the genocide model, Syrian and Pan-Armenian, that used to be there before that, pilgrimage to Deir ez-Zor. We are looking at several issues in this presentation, as I already mentioned, the transformation of cities, or the perception of the cities, how it's transformed, as well as the issue that in the Near Eastern, Middle Eastern cities, the war through its exogenous was dictated by exogenous factors and got out of the space and formed new realities that are detached, are not directly linked with the realities of the Middle East. So in this war, different wars and conflicts are incarnate, and in these cities, the models and processes are extrapolated onto other environments and cities. When we were writing the book, it was symbolically involving the Turkish factor, but when we completed it, it was materialized in the transfer of Syrian jihadists onto the Second Karabakh War. And we've mentioned that in the afterword. Why is Deir ez-Zor's issue important? Like I already mentioned, it is collective identity, the city, the collective identity, and the memorial space. And in the Armenian context, this is identified, as I mentioned, with the scene of crime. We could draw parallels with Auschwitz, but Auschwitz is not a city, it's a village. So the comparison Deir ez-Zor becomes somewhat unique in this sense because it doesn't exist in the collective memory as a city, it exists as a scene of crime and a memorial space. This is the location of Deir ez-Zor on the map, where it's about 240,000 strong. It's a 240,000 strong major industrial center, petrochemical industry. It's one of the richest, used to be one of the richest Syrian industrial centers until the most recent Syrian war. The Armenian presence in Deir ez-Zor essentially is symbolic. Prior to war, there were about 100 Armenians, 20 households of Armenian Apostolic, and about 250 Armenian Catholic Catholics originating from Mardin, and they have settled here prior to the genocide. The apostolic community is the refugees from the genocide, and the Catholic community is prior to the genocide. They are Arab speakers. We do not have massive Armenian compact population, just symbolic, but the symbolic space is larger than the confines of the Armenian community. What makes ez-Zor important? Because during the genocide, there were several deportation routes and massive destruction. ez-Zor was the terminal. There were transit camps along the route, and through those transit camps, the forced exodus took place. Both routes went through the Syrian territory and terminated at Deir. Deir was the death camp where in 1915-1916 massacres and atrocities took place. This is around Deir. It used to be a town back then. The so-called Armenian refugee camps emerged, which were singled out and taken to be eradicated in the desert. In this territory, until this day, relics are found of the victims. Around these sites, there are certain rites and memorial ceremonies taking place, emerging gradually. In the wake of the genocide in 1918-1919, ez-Zor fell under the British mandate because Turkey was defeated in the First World War, and the British troops entered ez-Zor. In the early 20s, there were about 500 Armenians in the town of ez-Zor, and the Armenian community started to emerge. By saying Armenian community, we mean not the presence of Armenians, but the institutionalization of the Armenian population. It immediately happened in the early 20s when they lost any hope of returning. The Lausanne Conference, before Lausanne Conference, Armenians still cherished hope of return. This is determined by the fact that in the Ottoman Empire, they've had multiple experience of resettlement, so maybe they were still hoping to get back. But in the wake of the Lausanne Conference, these hopes perished, and they already decided to stay put and build their lives thereafter. The first institutionalization steps were setting up a church and having a priest. In 2022, the priest was already operational in an abandoned house. An Armenian church was set up. In 28, a new church was built. What makes these 20s significant? Usually when we discuss issues of memory, we usually look at something that existed, then they remember it in the retrospect. In the 20s, it was forged as it went. The people who were alive, their relatives, their neighbors, their compatriots have perished. They have witnessed it firsthand. It was their immediate environment that was gone. And it was documented through the church, the national cemetery, and the school. They all three were called the Holy Martyrs. The school, the cemetery, and the church. The first church, the congregation was in an abandoned house, so was the school. The first attempts at bone collection took place in the early 20s. In 28, we could also look at this model in the contemporary sense. The Armenian transnational diaspora funded the construction of Saint Ripsime Church. Barsech Pelevjan, Egyptian benefactor, donated Egyptian gold coins to build the church. Ripsime, why Ripsime? Because it was his mother's name, and whoever was born later, most were called the baby girls Ripsime. The church was built, and they had set up, and they built also a memorial. The bones were collected, and there was a tomb-like memorial built next to the church. Since the 20s, it's already became a place of memory and memorials. In the early 30s, the Cilician Catholicos visited the site and they said it would be appropriate to call the church Martyrs Church and Deir the City of Martyrs. This small memorial site maintained its significance thereafter, but there's an issue here. We could discuss the issue of fear and cities. We know that the Syrian Armenian community is an urban community from beginnings onwards because there was a fear of desert and the fear of the environment where the massacres took place. So the Armenians started to congregate around cities. Deir ez-Zor was a desert environment with a massive Muslim population, so security issues were a major concern. There was the matter of fear. So Deir ez-Zor, and it was also the site of the crime. So Deir ez-Zor did not become a community center. The Armenians mostly concentrated in Aleppo and other major Syrian towns. This was a symbolic location. The issue of Deir ez-Zor, the issue of memorial space, became topical since the 60s. Most probably this is linked with the 50th anniversary of the genocide in 1965, and the Syrian Armenian community discussed building a new memorial complex at the same site. But this never materialized, and only in 1989 they built the Deir ez-Zor Memorial Complex. Essentially, this was a church, but not in the classical sense, but rather a memorial. We're talking about the transformation of a church into a museum and a site of remembrance. As the priests mentioned, they do not do marriages or baptisms there. It's more of a museum and a memorial space. The other issue was that from early onwards, the issue of memory and memorial was not only an urban issue. Since the early 20s, they started to collect relics and bones and form memorial spaces on the basis thereof. The first was in the Beirut Mayravank, where they collected the relics. The relics were brought in from Deir ez-Zor, but since then, Syria and Lebanon were under the French mandate. There are memoirs about French authorities prohibiting the importation of relics from Deir ez-Zor. We do not know the reason, but the assumption is it was the period of approximation between France and Turkey. French was negotiating borders with Turkey, and it was a period of approximation. But the Lebanese and Syrian Armenian communities organized a secret mission and transferred the relics from Deir ez-Zor to Mayravank. The other issue pertained to the memorial complex. As the architect Armanukyan mentions, Turkey was attentively following the construction attempts of the memorial, even attempted to ban and hold the process, but Hafez al-Assad, the president of Syria, was adamantly against their attempts. Prior to the war, the memorial complex was under the constant surveillance and monitoring by the Syrian Secret Service to prevent possible provocations. Since 89, they started building the new memorial complex. In 91, they finished it. Since this is a site of, there were three basic areas. One is Deir ez-Zor, the other is Resurrection Chapel, I do not know. The memorial service was formed in the church context. After the building of the Tzitsar Memorial Complex, the National Memory Service became civilian, but the church nature, religious nature continues to these days in the Near Eastern Armenian communities. The issue of political significance was also that in the years of Syrian-Turkish approximation between 2007 and 2010, the Syrian government prohibited major communal pilgrimages and memorial services towards the ez-Zor Memorial Complex. But beginning with 2011, the Syrian war broke out, and the ez-Zor Armenian community left the city in 11 and 12. The two Islamic groups controlled it together with the Armenians. Arab Christians also left, and Sunni Muslims stayed put. In 2012, the first explosion took place in the ez-Zor church. The door and some walls collapsed, but the structure was pretty sound and it stayed put. This was done by Al-Nusra. In 2012, on September 21, the ez-Zor complex was exploded through detonating bombs. This was not a result of war, it was predetermined. Ez-Zor was a split city. 40% was controlled by the Syrian army and another part by the Islamic groups. So the state army was under siege. It was over only in 2017 when the Arab Republic took it under control. The Armenian sector was under the Islamic control. The chronology and the location of the explosion identifies its symbolic significance. It was the memorial space of the remembrance of the Armenian genocide. Armenia and the Armenian diaspora immediately responded to those events, linking them to certain political processes. The first process was that the 100th centennial of the genocide had to take place, and Turkey was precluding the possible commemoration. 2 days prior to that, in the Armenia Diaspora Conference, the Silesian Catholicos proclaimed the intention to launch litigation to restore, get back the cis Catholicos aid. This resonated in the Armenian reality. The group that exploded the memorial was not completely identified. The assumption is that it could have been one of the Islamic groups with the Turkish orientation, inclination, because there were various factions thereat. Naturally, the response was resonating. The subsequent ez-Zor developments were also interesting. When ez-Zor was liberated in 2018, Assad received a delegation of Armenian Syrian businessmen in Damascus and promised to rebuild the church. The Turkish press immediately responded, saying that instead of restoring the water infrastructure of his own country, Assad is restoring the headache of Turkey, the memorial complex. The next year, in the presidential chancery, the presentation of the book Exodus Towards ez-Zor was presented, and subsequently this was also included in the Syrian school curriculum. And already this year, the first pilgrimage took place towards the ez-Zor church to mark the memory of the genocide. This work has several layers and strata, and if there are questions, I will reflect and answer them. Thank you.